"You're completely useless." Richard Sutton barked across the glossy cabin of his private jet, his voice cutting through the hum of the idling engines as if it had the power to freeze the very air. Evelyn Parker paused mid-step, a microfiber cloth clutched lightly in her hand, eyes flicking to the polished control panel where red lights blinked subtly, almost teasingly, under the sleek glass surface. The sunlight spilling through the oval windows scattered across the floor in sharp, bright lines, reflecting off the chrome fixtures and glinting off Richard's expensive watch as he leaned back in his leather seat, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth as though the world was his playground and she was nothing more than an interruption. The cabin smelled faintly of jet fuel mixed with the citrus polish she had used just minutes ago, and every surface gleamed under her meticulous touch, a silent testament to her dedication. Evelyn's heart didn't race, nor did her hands shake. She had walked onto this plane countless times, observing the routines of wealthy passengers, the meticulous pre-flight rituals, the flick of switches and the hum of turbines. Yet today something felt different. She inhaled slowly, letting the scent of leather and metal anchor her as her gaze moved to the rows of overhead panels. The tiny switches and gauges that might seem insignificant to someone like Richard, but spoke volumes to someone who had grown up learning the language of machines. The hum of the engines shifted subtly, a low vibration under the floor that resonated in her boots as she adjusted her stance, feet shoulder-width apart, ready yet invisible, a shadow among the polished opulence. Richard's eyes narrowed, a mix of irritation and curiosity as he watched her hesitate near the cockpit door, fingers brushing lightly against the control console, not with clumsy uncertainty, but with the precision of someone who understood cause and effect in ways his lavish upbringing had never allowed him to see. A flight attendant drifted past, tray in hand, offering water to the seated guests, and the soft click of her heels against the floor punctuated the tension, an almost cinematic counterpoint to the staccato rhythm of Richard's impatience. Evelyn's mind replayed the pre-flight checklist she had memorized from the briefings she had observed over the years, the emergency protocols, the tiny details that could avert disaster. Details that no one in the leather seats or tailored suits had bothered to notice. She tilted her head slightly, noticing a subtle warning light flickering faintly on a panel that Richard had dismissed with a wave of his hand, a small, almost imperceptible pulse that meant nothing to him, but screamed to her trained instincts. The cabin seemed to constrict around her, the hum of the engines louder in her ears, her own breath steady, almost imperceptible, as she took a step forward, fingertips grazing the panel, assessing, calculating, measuring the potential fallout of a single unnoticed error. Outside, the sunlight glinted off the wings of the jet, casting angular shadows across the cabin floor, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause, the moment stretching taut as Richard leaned forward, voice sharp, dismissive. "I don't need your input, Parker." She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Her brown eyes met his icy blue with calm defiance, a subtle undercurrent of knowledge that had been earned through years of careful observation, of learning to see what others ignored. Every polished surface, every gleam of sunlight on metal, every faint vibration beneath the floorboards seemed to echo her inner readiness, the quiet competence that contrasted sharply with the bluster and entitlement radiating from the man in the captain's seat. She adjusted her stance, glancing briefly at the row of switches that controlled critical systems, each one a silent sentinel waiting for recognition, her mind mapping the connections and dependencies, tracing a line through the labyrinth of circuits and warnings. The air seemed charged, electric, anticipation mingling with the mundane ritual of pre-flight checks, as Evelyn Parker, a waitress often dismissed, now stood at the intersection of authority and insight, knowing that a single action, a single word, might ripple through this cabin of polished power and bring clarity to a situation the man in the seat had arrogantly assumed he controlled completely. Evelyn Parker stepped back slightly, her hands brushing against the smooth surface of the counter as she took a slow, measured breath, allowing her eyes to adjust to the ambient light that spilled in from the oval windows. She had always been drawn to details that others overlooked, a habit cultivated during long afternoons observing mechanics and flight attendants at the regional airport where her mother worked. Her uniform, simple and unassuming, seemed to vanish into the polished cabin, making her movements appear almost ghost-like against the backdrop of leather seats and chrome accents. Every step she took was deliberate, a quiet assertion of presence without confrontation, each click of her shoes against the cabin floor measured and rhythmic, echoing faintly in the still air. She glanced at the instrument panel, noting the alignment of gauges and the faint glow of indicator lights, her mind running through mental checklists memorized from countless hours of observation rather than formal training. Her fingers hovered near a small lever, not touching yet, as if sensing the weight of responsibility that even the most experienced crew might not recognize. She remembered her mother telling her stories of pilots trusting only what they could verify themselves, of moments when a keen eye had prevented catastrophe in the busy skies over Atlanta and Miami. Evelyn allowed a faint smile, not of amusement, but of quiet understanding, acknowledging the invisible threads that connected precision, vigilance, and foresight. She moved toward the service console, her hands steady, touching the smooth metal surface with a gentle confidence that contrasted with the hubbub of pre-flight activity. Through the windows, the bright morning sun reflected off the tarmac in brilliant shards, illuminating the curvature of the fuselage, casting elongated shadows across the polished cabin floor. She could feel the subtle vibration of the engines beneath her feet, a low hum that resonated through her boots, reminding her of the immense energy contained within this finely tuned machine. Evelyn allowed her gaze to sweep across the cabin, observing the arrangement of seats, the position of overhead compartments, and the subtle shifts in lighting, each detail cataloged and assessed in a silent mental map. She adjusted her stance, feet planted firmly, shoulders squared, projecting an aura of calm readiness that did not demand attention yet seemed to draw it subtly from those who passed through the cabin. Her breath was even, controlled, a slow rhythm that mirrored the measured confidence in her movements, each deliberate step an unspoken declaration that she belonged not by privilege but by competence and awareness. The soft click of the service door opening, the muted shuffle of a flight attendant passing with a tray, and the distant murmur of conversation outside seemed to form a symphony of ordinary sound that heightened her awareness rather than distract from it. Evelyn paused near the forward panel, scanning rows of indicators, noting minor discrepancies in alignment and illumination that might escape a cursory glance. Her mind traced the circuitry, linking visible cues to potential outcomes, the accumulation of observed knowledge shaping a clear, precise understanding of the environment she navigated. She exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in the cabin subtly shift around her measured focus, the polished surfaces and the filtered sunlight, reflecting not just her own careful movements, but the latent potential she carried within. In that quiet stretch of time, surrounded by the hum of pre-flight activity and the subtle vibration of engines, Evelyn Parker embodied the calm, unwavering presence of someone who had honed the ability to see, to understand, and to act with insight beyond what appearances suggested. Evelyn Parker took a step back, giving Richard Sutton a clear view of the forward panel and the intricacies of the console that dominated the front of the cabin, her posture calm yet purposeful. The sunlight through the windows highlighted the subtle contours of the gauges and switches, each one a testament to the engineering precision that allowed the jet to glide through the sky with effortless power. Richard shifted in his seat, the leather creaking softly beneath him, his gaze flicking from the polished surfaces to Evelyn with a mixture of curiosity and mild irritation. The cabin smelled faintly of ozone and polished metal, a clean sharpness that seemed to sharpen the tension between observation and dismissal. Flight attendants moved quietly around the space, offering drinks and adjusting overhead compartments, their movements almost ceremonial, yet Evelyn barely noticed, focused entirely on the alignment of the indicators in front of her. Each dial, each blinking light, spoke in a language of balance, timing, and consequence, and she read it fluently, connecting patterns to potential outcomes with practiced clarity. Her eyes lingered on a small amber indicator, pulsing with a subtle rhythm, signaling a potential imbalance in the fuel distribution system that might be overlooked if not addressed immediately. Evelyn's mind raced through scenarios, tracing circuits and cross-checking against safety protocols she had observed and memorized over years of watching experienced technicians at regional airports. She adjusted her stance slightly, feet firmly planted, hands poised above the controls, exuding quiet confidence, a contrast to Richard's animated gestures and impatient tapping of the armrest. Outside, the tarmac gleamed under the mid-morning sun, planes taxiing in the distance, the hum of ground vehicles barely audible through the thick insulation of the cabin walls. Yet every vibration transmitted through the floor, a faint pulse that reminded Evelyn of the stakes she carried in her measured observation. She exhaled slowly, shoulders relaxing, allowing the ambient sound and light to anchor her, the polished surfaces and reflective panels forming a cage of clarity around her. Richard leaned forward, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing slightly as he watched her, sensing that she was more than a background presence, that the quiet authority she radiated was built on understanding he had yet to appreciate. The hum of the engines beneath the floorboards grew slightly, a low, steady vibration that seemed almost to synchronize with Evelyn's heartbeat, her mind mapping potential sequences, assessing risks, and considering the consequences of each possible action. She moved her hand slightly toward the lever controlling the auxiliary power unit, the faint metallic click of her movement blending with the subtle mechanical rhythm of the cabin, her focus absolute, unshaken by the wealthy eyes fixed upon her. Every glance, every slight adjustment of a switch, every careful shift of her weight projected precision, competence, and quiet assertion, demonstrating in a subtle, undeniable way that preparedness and attentiveness could equal or surpass authority even in a cabin filled with experience, wealth, and expectations. Evelyn's gaze traveled over the controls once more, noting the interplay between pressure gauges, fuel indicators, and system lights, calculating the optimal sequence to ensure stability and safety without disturbing the finely tuned environment. Every observation a silent negotiation between knowledge and circumstance, between careful skill and the dismissive authority seated just behind her. She allowed a faint nod to herself, a confirmation of awareness, before taking another measured step toward the center of the cabin, her boots making soft contact with the polished floor, each movement deliberate, demonstrating the quiet mastery of someone who had observed, learned, and anticipated in a world where being seen was optional, yet being correct was essential. The light shifted across the cabin, the metallic sheen of panels catching the brightness of the sun, emphasizing the contrast between Evelyn's calm, deliberate approach and Richard's restless, expectant posture, the visual tension highlighting the subtle battle between authority and expertise, perception and reality, as the private jet prepared for the impending journey. Evelyn Parker took a deliberate breath, letting her senses align with the rhythm of the cabin, her eyes sweeping over the array of indicators and switches that glimmered faintly under the cabin lights. She shifted closer to the main panel, her fingers hovering just above the buttons, not yet touching, as she traced the sequence in her mind, connecting each gauge and readout to the corresponding system it controlled. The sunlight streaming through the windows painted the polished surfaces in warm tones, reflecting off the chrome accents and highlighting the meticulous detail in the cabin that most passengers would overlook. Richard Sutton leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as he observed her movements, a subtle tension creeping into his posture, the leather of his chair creaking softly under his slight shift forward. Evelyn's gaze traveled smoothly from one indicator to the next, noting the faint blinking of a minor warning light that had gone unnoticed by the staff, its pulse barely audible in the ambient hum of the engines. She recalled similar patterns she had studied during her time assisting with ground operations, the careful calibration of systems that required attention even when they seemed insignificant. Each step she took across the cabin floor was measured, her boots producing soft clicks that resonated subtly against the polished metal and laminated surfaces, blending with the quiet murmur of the engines and the occasional shuffle of the flight attendants. She reached the central control area, her hands poised above the main switches, a calm authority in her stance that contrasted sharply with the restless energy emanating from Richard as he leaned slightly forward, voice low and controlled, commenting on the schedule and readiness of the jet. unaware that her observations had already anticipated the critical details he had overlooked. The hum of the engines beneath the floor provided a continuous undercurrent, a vibration that she felt in her feet and through the soles of her boots, reminding her of the latent energy contained in the system she monitored. She moved her hand closer to a specific lever, her fingers tracing the outline of the control with the precision of someone who understood the mechanics behind every switch, every gauge, and every light. The ambient lighting shifted slightly as the sun climbed higher, casting elongated reflections across the cabin floor and creating a pattern of light and shadow that seemed to mirror the subtle tension in the cabin. Evelyn's breathing remained steady, controlled, each inhale and exhale synchronized with the minute shifts in the jet's subtle vibrations. Her attention was absolute, her mind calculating contingencies, cross-referencing possible outcomes, and preparing for any scenario that might unfold from the unnoticed warning light. She adjusted her stance slightly, the weight balanced evenly between her feet, projecting a quiet confidence that did not demand attention but naturally drew it from the man in the seat behind her. Richard's eyes followed her movements, the flicker of curiosity crossing his face, the rigid set of his jaw betraying a slight recognition that the calm, precise focus she displayed was not born of casual familiarity, but of experience and understanding he had yet to measure. Every element in the cabin, from the polished panels to the reflected sunlight, from the quiet hum of the engines to the controlled movements of Evelyn, created a tableau of anticipation, a delicate balance between authority and insight, where her presence quietly reshaped the perception of competence and preparedness within the private space of the jet. She exhaled softly, eyes fixed on the indicators, fingers steady above the controls, embodying the quiet, unassuming mastery of someone who had trained her mind to perceive the unnoticed, to anticipate the overlooked, and to act with precision at the critical moment when knowledge met opportunity, all under the gaze of a man who had assumed he controlled every aspect of this environment. Richard Sutton's expression tightened, a subtle crease forming between his brows as he shifted his weight in the leather seat, eyes narrowing as he studied Evelyn Parker with a mix of disbelief and reluctant attention. The polished cabin, with sunlight reflecting off the chrome fixtures and the smooth surfaces of the instrument panels, seemed to shrink around the tension, each glint of light emphasizing the contrast between his poised, wealthy demeanor and her calm, precise movements. Evelyn did not flinch under his gaze. Her stance remained firm yet unobtrusive, hands hovering above the controls, ready to intervene but moving with measured restraint, aware that any hasty action could unsettle the delicate balance of systems she was monitoring. She spoke with quiet authority, pointing out a sequence of indicators that had gone unnoticed, her voice steady and measured, carrying the weight of observation rather than defiance. Richard's jaw tightened further, and he let out a slow exhale, the air in the cabin seeming to thicken with the unspoken challenge of knowledge against assumed superiority. Flight attendants paused in their movements, their soft footsteps and the faint clinking of service equipment punctuating the tense silence, as the hum of the jet engines beneath the floor added a subtle vibration that resonated through the polished cabin, echoing the anticipation of a critical moment. Evelyn traced the interconnections between panels and gauges, her mind calculating contingencies, the potential outcomes of each overlooked indicator forming a mental map of responsibility and consequence that Richard had never been trained to consider. He leaned forward slightly, eyes following her movements, the polished leather of his seat creaking softly under the shift, and for a moment, the veneer of absolute authority flickered, revealing a hint of uncertainty as he realized that her insight extended beyond what he had assumed possible for someone in her position. Evelyn's gaze remained steady, scanning the alignment of dials and blinking lights, fingers lightly brushing against a lever, demonstrating awareness and precision without abruptness, her presence asserting competence through subtlety and quiet control. The sunlight streaming through the oval windows created angular reflections on the polished floor, illuminating the subtle movements of her hands and casting dynamic shadows across the cabin, visual markers of the contrast between her methodical focus and Richard's restless impatience. She allowed a faint nod to herself, confirming her assessment, while the faint hum of the auxiliary systems underfoot reverberated subtly through her stance, reinforcing the tangible weight of the machinery she was observing. The indicators she highlighted flickered in alignment, signaling a potential issue that had remained dormant until her intervention, and Richard's eyes widened slightly, the first tangible recognition of her understanding penetrating the barriers of dismissive arrogance he had maintained. He leaned back again, shoulders shifting with tension, watching as she moved deliberately through the cabin space. Each step measured, each gesture precise, her focus absolute, a quiet assertion of capability that radiated from her every movement and reshaped the perception of authority in that carefully controlled environment. The contrast between the polished, meticulously arranged cabin and the invisible depth of knowledge Evelyn displayed created a palpable tension, a silent acknowledgment that expertise and preparation could command respect even in the presence of inherited power and self-assured wealth, as the private jet remained suspended in anticipation, waiting for her next observation to validate the quiet competence she embodied. Evelyn Parker stepped back, slightly from the panel, allowing her hands to rest lightly at her sides. The cabin bathed in a soft golden light as the morning sun filtered through the oval windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. She inhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, each breath a quiet reminder of her presence and preparedness, a contrast to the subtle tension lingering in the air around Richard Sutton. The leather of his seat creaked faintly as he shifted, eyes tracking her every movement, a mixture of skepticism and tentative attention reflected in the slight tightening of his jaw and the furrow of his brow. Evelyn's gaze drifted across the rows of seats, the gleaming surfaces, the meticulous arrangement of overhead compartments, and the instrument panels, observing each detail with a clarity honed by years of careful attention and practice, absorbing the ambient sounds of the jet, the gentle hum of the auxiliary power unit, the faint whir of cooling vents, and the soft shuffle of flight attendants moving about their tasks with precise, quiet steps. She allowed her focus to settle on the control panel once more, noting the subtle glow of a minor warning indicator, its light blinking faintly like a heartbeat in the polished steel, signaling a potential issue that only someone with experience and insight could perceive. Her posture remained calm, yet deliberate, shoulders squared, feet grounded firmly on the floor, projecting confidence through stillness rather than action. Richard leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him, fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, a rhythm matching the quiet tension in the cabin. The lines of authority he carried meeting the invisible boundary of knowledge and preparedness that Evelyn had established. She tilted her head slightly, eyes tracing the pathways of circuitry and indicator lights, mentally running through sequences, potential outcomes, and contingencies with methodical precision, each calculation quiet, invisible, yet profoundly present in the way she carried herself. The sunlight shifted across the cabin, highlighting the reflective surfaces of the panels and seats, illuminating the subtle expressions of the people present, capturing the contrast between Evelyn's measured poise and the restless energy of a man unaccustomed to being observed with this level of attention and insight. Her hands remained still, yet ready, hovering lightly over the surface as if sensing the flow of energy and information, prepared to act at the exact moment her observation dictated, embodying competence without assertion, control without confrontation. The ambient hum of the engines beneath the floorboards seemed to harmonize with her heartbeat, a quiet reminder of the machinery's power and the responsibility that lay in recognizing what others might dismiss. Evelyn allowed a faint, almost imperceptible nod to herself, a confirmation of readiness and awareness, her gaze sweeping the cabin once more, taking in the interplay of light, shadow, and mechanical systems, the subtle dynamics of authority and attention that filled the space. She breathed slowly, evenly, allowing the quiet of the moment to anchor her, her presence resonating through the cabin not as an intrusion but as a silent, undeniable assertion of capability, a calm force within the structured opulence of the private jet, observed by a man beginning to recognize the depth and precision of her awareness and understanding. The subtle alarm on the control panel flickered, a steady amber warning that Evelyn Parker had anticipated, and for the first time, Richard Sutton's confident demeanor faltered, his eyes widening slightly as he realized that the minor detail she had highlighted carried more weight than he had ever considered. The sunlight streaming through the oval windows glinted off the polished surfaces of the cabin, reflecting against the chrome fixtures and casting long, angular shadows across the floor, emphasizing the contrast between her calm, measured presence and the restless tension of the man seated behind her. Evelyn did not move hastily. She remained poised, hands lightly resting above the panel, eyes scanning the sequences of lights and gauges, mentally cross-referencing each signal with the corresponding system response she had memorized from years of careful observation and practical learning. The cabin felt suspended in time, the hum of the engines beneath their feet providing a low, constant vibration, a quiet underscore to the unfolding recognition of her insight. Richard leaned forward, the polished leather of his seat creaking faintly as he adjusted his posture, fingers clasped tightly in front of him, his sharp blue eyes tracing every deliberate movement she made. The lines of authority he had always wielded now intersecting with a competence he had not expected in someone he had dismissed. Evelyn allowed a subtle nod to herself, confirming her assessment, her gaze sweeping the array of instruments, noting slight variances in pressure and alignment that required immediate consideration to ensure the stability and safety of the aircraft. The sunlight caught in her eyes, highlighting their focused intensity as she reached toward a lever, gently adjusting it in synchronization with the readings, each motion precise and measured, revealing a depth of understanding that contrasted with the assumptions of the cabin's occupant. Richard's posture shifted, the first signs of acknowledgment appearing as his brow lifted slightly and the tension in his jaw eased, a silent admission that her foresight had a value beyond what his initial judgment had allowed. The flight attendants moved quietly, their soft footsteps and subtle glances reflecting an unspoken awareness of the changing dynamic in the cabin, as Evelyn continued her careful, methodical adjustments, maintaining a rhythm that harmonized with the latent energy of the jet systems. Every indicator she corrected, every subtle adjustment she executed, reinforced the quiet assertion of her capability, and the polished surfaces and reflective chrome seemed to capture the shift in perception, highlighting the precision and focus that defined her approach. Richard leaned back slowly, his gaze lingering on her with a mixture of respect and astonishment, the hum of the auxiliary systems beneath the floor providing a rhythmic backdrop that accentuated the contrast between his earlier dismissal and the undeniable clarity of her expertise. Evelyn's posture remained calm, unassuming yet authoritative, embodying a quiet mastery that communicated competence without a word, her presence reshaping the atmosphere in the cabin as sunlight danced across the polished surfaces, illuminating a moment of realization and silent acknowledgment that her observation and intervention were both precise and critical. In that suspended, glowing space, with the jet's soft vibration underfoot and the golden morning light streaming in, Richard Sutton finally recognized the depth of knowledge, preparation, and attention that Evelyn Parker brought to the cabin, a subtle yet profound reversal of expectation that shifted the balance of authority and insight in a space previously dominated by assumed control. Evelyn Parker exhaled slowly, letting the tension that had accumulated in the cabin ease slightly as she stood upright, hands resting lightly at her sides, the sunlight streaming through the windows casting warm, golden highlights on her focused expression. Richard Sutton remained seated, the furrow in his brow softening as he allowed a moment for the weight of realization to settle, his posture gradually shifting from rigid authority to contemplative acknowledgment. The polished cabin reflected the quiet transformation in the atmosphere, the chrome and leather surfaces catching the morning light, creating a tapestry of warmth and clarity that mirrored the unspoken understanding developing between them. Evelyn's eyes met Richard's for a brief, meaningful moment, and in that gaze, there was no boastfulness, no triumphalism, only calm assurance and a quiet satisfaction in having anticipated a problem that could have gone unnoticed. She moved deliberately to the rear of the cabin, her boots clicking softly against the polished floor, each step echoing the rhythm of competence and quiet confidence that had guided her throughout the situation. Richard adjusted in his seat once more, leaning forward slightly, a subtle gesture that indicated recognition and the first hint of genuine respect for the insight she had provided. The flight attendants continued their movements, careful and unobtrusive, maintaining the background flow of service while casting discreet glances toward the front of the cabin, the hum of the engines beneath their feet providing a constant, grounding presence that underscored the gravity of what had just occurred. Evelyn's posture remained composed, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the cabin one final time to ensure every system was stable and all indicators had returned to normal, a silent demonstration of thoroughness and mastery. Richard spoke softly, his tone measured and devoid of the earlier impatience, acknowledging her assessment and the importance of her intervention without fanfare or unnecessary words. The cabin, previously dominated by the energy of assumed control, now felt balanced, the contrast between expectation and reality softened by quiet competence, the subtle shift in power dynamic marked by mutual recognition rather than conflict. Sunlight continued to illuminate the details of the jet's interior, the reflections glinting off the polished surfaces as if accentuating the transition from tension to resolution, a visual accompaniment to the nuanced understanding that had taken root between them. Evelyn allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod, confirming internally that the situation had been addressed with precision and care, her calm assurance serving as a steady anchor amidst the mechanical complexity of the jet. Richard's eyes lingered for a moment longer, absorbing the implications of her expertise and the fact that what had initially seemed a minor, inconsequential observation had averted a potential issue, reinforcing the value of attentive observation and practical knowledge over assumptions of authority. As Evelyn moved toward the cabin door, her movements measured yet graceful, the ambient light and soft vibrations of the engines framed her presence, highlighting the subtle authority and respect she now commanded not through status, but through insight, preparation, and the quiet execution of skill. In that suspended, luminous space, the private jet seemed to breathe with a new rhythm, a shared acknowledgment of competence and responsibility, and the once dismissive authority of Richard Sutton had shifted imperceptibly, replaced with an awareness of her indispensable contribution and the quiet power of informed action. Evelyn Parker moved toward the rear of the cabin, her steps steady, measured, the polished floor reflecting the warm glow of the morning sunlight as it streamed through the oval windows. Richard Sutton remained seated, his posture slightly relaxed now, the rigid tension of earlier replaced with a contemplative stillness, a subtle acknowledgment of the insight and precision Evelyn had demonstrated. The hum of the engines beneath the floor provided a gentle vibration that underscored the quiet authority of the moment, blending with the soft murmur of the flight attendants as they continued their duties with subdued awareness of the changed dynamic in the cabin. Evelyn's eyes swept over the final indicators, noting that all systems were stable and that the minor warning she had anticipated was now addressed, a silent confirmation of her competence and thorough attention. She allowed a faint, self-assured nod to herself, acknowledging the completion of her assessment and the resolution of the situation without unnecessary fanfare or proclamation. Richard exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing further, his eyes lingering on Evelyn with a newfound respect, the sharp edge of dismissal softened into quiet recognition of her capability. The sunlight illuminated the contours of the cabin, glinting off chrome accents and the polished leather seats, creating a visual rhythm that mirrored the subtle shift in authority and perception between them. Evelyn's presence remained calm and unassuming, yet undeniably potent in its demonstration of knowledge and preparedness, projecting a quiet mastery that contrasted with the initial assumptions of status and authority Richard had carried. She moved to the side, allowing a clear path to the cabin exit, each step deliberate, her focus unbroken, yet her aura of confidence radiating throughout the space, reshaping the perception of competence without a single word being exchanged. Richard's gaze followed her, the first hints of a smile tugging at his lips, a silent acknowledgment of the lesson imparted not through confrontation, but through observation, foresight, and measured action. The light shifted subtly across the cabin, casting elongated shadows and illuminating the fine details of the jet's interior, each reflection reinforcing the narrative of careful preparation and understated excellence that Evelyn embodied. As she reached the cabin door, her hand hovered briefly over the handle before she gently opened it, stepping into the light that filled the corridor beyond, leaving behind an atmosphere transformed, where knowledge, competence, and quiet assurance commanded attention more effectively than any display of inherited power. Richard remained seated, the polished leather of his chair cradling him as he absorbed the implications of what had occurred, a subtle lesson in humility and respect for insight earned through dedication and observation. In that moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, a silent acknowledgment of the importance of seeing beyond appearances, valuing expertise, and recognizing that true authority can emerge from preparation, attentiveness, and quiet confidence. The lesson was clear. Respect is earned through competence and calm decisiveness. And sometimes the most profound influence comes from those who move silently yet decisively, demonstrating that power does not always reside in wealth or status, but in knowledge, awareness, and the courage to act thoughtfully when it matters most, reminding us that taking the time to observe, to understand, and to execute with care can alter outcomes and shift perceptions, encouraging reflection on how we evaluate competence, authority, and the often unseen potential in those we might initially underestimate.